Hey, welcome back. Today's video is going to be about minimizing muzzle rise, the techniques necessary and the rifle build dynamics that are involved in minimizing that muzzle rise so that you can get the kind of sight picture that I have and follow through with minimal movement of the reticle upon firing. Now, there's no magic here. There's no special technique. It's all about simple physics. So let's go through the items that I would check first if I had a rifle that was rising too much under recoil. As you've probably already assumed, the muzzle brake makes a big difference. Now, the muzzle brake is not going to solve every problem you've ever had. It's not designed to do that. If it is designed to do that, it's going to be like hitting the muzzle with a sledgehammer every time you pull the trigger, and that's going to make it really hard to see downrange as the rifle vibrates itself half to death on every single shot. Instead, let's talk about making a rifle that is inherently stable and therefore doesn't want to deviate quite so much. And then we'll just use the muzzle brake to finish it off, like the cherry on top. So the first consideration for minimizing muzzle rise is traction. If the rifle is going across a surface that is not in line with the bore, so to speak, vertically, and it's dragging heavily like you would get if you put these grip tape pieces on your ACC Elite, well, you're going to get more muzzle rise, because the rifle is going to catch on the bag and then it's going to create a pivot point below the rifle. That pivot point is going to inevitably result in the muzzle going uphill. Because I don't care how strong you are, you cannot stop the rifle from that initial recoil pulse before the bullet gets to the muzzle brake, because there is some acceleration of mass there, and that causes the rifle to accelerate rearward toward you. I'm not shooting free recoil. I'm shooting good and solid on the rifle, and it moves every single time I pull the trigger. It just doesn't go up and down. Speaking of traction, your bag surface is also critical. If you just wax this with super sticky wax, it's going to grab every time you pull the trigger, and that's going to cause the muzzle to rise more than it would if it was slick to the stock or chassis in my case. If it can slide easily, it's not going to grip. And if it doesn't grip, it's not going to want to pivot on whatever the bag is laying on. But there are some rest situations that you cannot correct for by simply making them slicker. A bipod, for example, you would have to have it on a pretty slick piece of plastic to keep the feet from digging in. In this case, when the rifle recoils rearward, it's going to pivot at the feet of the bipod, which is going to make the muzzle rise. I get more muzzle rise shooting prone with a bipod than I do shooting in position standing off of a bag. Because if you have a pivot point below the bore line of the rifle's going to want to pivot there. And that pivot point is going to create muzzle rise. It's a given. It's known and accepted. It's inevitable with the design of our rifles. If we designed them upside down, they might shoot differently, but they don't. Speaking of designing rifles, you have to design your rifle properly. For example, my PRS rifle is balanced at the appropriate point for shooting off of a bag, somewhere right about here where my hand is. Now, that's one form of balance. The other form of balance is not in this plane. It's not along the longitudinal axis, so to speak. It's about the longitudinal axis. Let me show you. As you can see, the rifle is balanced along the bore line in the vertical direction, so to speak. In other words, there's as much mass above the center line as there is below the center line. Now, adding a magazine is going to put more mass below, which is going to contribute to muzzle rise. But being close to balanced is really critical for success. Now, if I were to take a different rifle, like my hunting rifle, and try to balance it on the muzzle, it would fall toward the butt every single time because there's more mass below the center line than there is above the center line. That rifle is inherently going to accelerate rearward, and the muzzle is going to rise at the same time because there's more resistance to the acceleration at the bottom of the rifle than there is at the top. So rifle balance is critical, whether you're talking about the X, Y, or Z axis. You have to be balanced in the right point front to back and vertically within the rifle's envelope in order to get the best possible recoil response. But that's not the only thing about balance that's critical. Mass distribution plays a big part in this. If you put heavy weights on both ends of an object, it's going to be harder to start accelerating in a spinning direction, like a flywheel. That effect in and of itself helps to mitigate some of the muzzle rise. The rifle simply has to expend more energy trying to get it rotating, and that gives you an opportunity to stop it with your body. Your body position behind the rifle is critical as well. You need to get directly behind the rifle, squared up with your shoulders to the target, because getting out here on the pocket is going to allow your shoulder to fold back and put forces on the bottom of the recoil pad. Once again, adding an effective weight to the bottom of the rifle, causing the muzzle to rise. If instead you bring that recoil pad in so far that you're touching the blood vessels right here on the side of your neck with the top of the recoil pad, you're probably going to get a much better response out of the rifle. As a matter of fact, I use that set of blood vessels as a reference point. When I feel the recoil pad touching that, not pushing on it hard, just touching it, I know I'm in the right spot with the recoil pad because that puts the recoil pad right here in on the center of my chest, allowing me to absorb the recoil more straight back and also mitigating any upward movement of the muzzle and downward movement of the butt in this case because I have the recoil pad established on my body. Thinking of the recoil pad, you notice mine is raised up pretty high. The whole idea is to get at least some of the recoil pad directly in line with the bore. Try to get as much force as close to the center line of the bore as possible when you're shooting the rifle. That's going to also help you mitigate recoil and muzzle rise. Now, these are not the only things that affect your muzzle rise on your rifle. That muzzle brake makes a big difference. I do recommend the Botnia for that very purpose, but it is a very expensive muzzle brake. Other muzzle brakes can vary a little bit, but honestly, I have sworn off muzzle brakes that shoot gas upward for good reason. They tend to induce a vibration in the rifle, and that vibration obscures your vision downrange. Even though the muzzle didn't rise, that overwhelming vibration for that first 300, 400, 500 yards of the bullet's flight is going to make it really hard for you to see the trace, the impact point in the dirt if you miss, or the impact point on the plate if you hit. So in the end, mitigating muzzle rise is a matter of getting your physics right. You have to get the balance point of the rifle right, both vertically and longitudinally. You also need to get the mass distributed as far out to the ends as possible for the amount of weight that you have. Increasing weight is always good, but is not going to solve it alone. You also need to reduce the traction on the bag that you're shooting off of to the point you possibly can in order to minimize the amount of pivot effect you get from the bag below the rifle. Last but not least, you have to have a solid position behind the rifle. I can't overemphasize this. No matter what muzzle brake you're shooting, no matter what suppressor you have or rifle design you have, if you aren't behind the rifle squarely and correctly and you let that rifle run, it's going to rise on you. Free recoil, my rifle will rise about 5 to 6 mils. With it up against my shoulder, it rises virtually none, at least if my position's decent. So until next time, think about physics when you're thinking about getting your rifle to shoot better, and I'll see you in the next video.